Hello, everyone. My name is Artur Kamczycki. I am a lecturer at University of Poznan, Poland. The fields of my research are the early 20th century Russian avant-garde and the Jewish iconosphere of that time. And today I would like to present a few words on Lissitzky's Red Wedge. The title of the presentation is Lissitzky Red Wedge from avant-garde to Kabbalah. And let's skip to the presentation. Okay, Lazar Mardukowicz-Lissitzky, known also as Lissitzky, is one of the most recognizable figures of the Soviet avant-garde of the early 20th century. In 1918, Lissitzky became closely associated with the Bolshevik movement, for which he made a poster in 1919 entitled Beat the White with the Red Wedge. My presentation today will focus on the analysis and interpretation of this very work, tracing Lissitzky's interpretations to the Jewish tradition. The symbolism of this work relates to the idea of creating the utopian messianic world, which is relevant for the Soviet revolutionary interpretation, but also refers to the roots of the Jewish mysticism and the Kabbalist ideas, just to the Kabbalah. It has been repeatedly mentioned in the history of art and source literature that Lissitzky's creative method developed under the influence of Kazimir Malevich and his theory of suprematism. In his paintings, Malevich would often use simple geometric figures such as squares, circles, and triangles to create abstract compositions, and a parallel approach is visible in Lissitzky's art. In 1919, Lissitzky was invited to Vitebsk by Marc Chagall to take over the local professorship of graphics and architecture departments. Soon, however, he joined Kazimir Malevich at the Institute of Material Culture in St. Petersburg, apparently attracted by his specific type of mysticism manifested as a call for general reconstruction of the world, which Lissitzky felt was close to his own messianic national tradition. Thus, it's very likely that both Chagall and Malevich had influence on Lissitzky, with the latter of the two providing inspiration for his Red Wedge poster, according to numerous researchers. The general layout of the work consists of a sharp red triangle emerging from the upper left part of the pictorial field, piercing through the circumference of a white circle and driving towards its center. The triangle dominates over the circle, pushing it down and sideways, away from the center and into the black area in the picture. In this work, the artist uses certain forces, such as gravity, movement, and dynamism, as well as applies to a particular narration to the geometric structures. Art historians believe that this work is an affirmation of the revolution and the victory of the new order over the old world. The ideological and political ideas are conveyed here by forms and colors, where the white passive circle corresponds to the white garments, the tsardom, and the Orthodox Church, whereas the red dynamic triangle denotes the Bolsheviks and the revolution. By imparting the tone of propaganda to those simple geometric forms, Lissitzky employs the new artistic language, namely Malevich's suprematism. However, an in-depth analysis, which I will attempt to do in my talk, reveals that behind the political dimension of his work, the artist conceals a rich sphere of Jewish and messianic motifs, which are closely intertwined with the context of the revolution. Lissitzky himself wrote, I quote, "In Moscow in 1918, there flashed before my eyes a short circuit which split the world in two. This single blow pushed the time we call the present like a wedge between yesterday and tomorrow. My efforts are now directed to driving the wedge deeper. One must belong on this side or on that. There is no midway." End quote. This concept is illustrated in an interesting way by Lissitzky's project of the Apikoires, translated as Atheist magazine cover from 1931. A large, dark, sharp-edged triangle splits a globe, creating a division between the silhouette of a religious Jew standing on its surface and his synagogue. The triangle located on the right is facing in the opposite direction and contains a photo of what looks like a May Day parade moving upwards in the direction set by the pointed angle of the triangle. It seems that the two figures diverge semantically and graphically, evoking the separation of the old religion-based approach from the new, seemingly secular vision of the world. Apikoires is a heretic who does not believe in orthodox teachings and the revelation. He defies the religious tradition and therefore will not have a share in the world to come and will be eternally condemned. However, Lissitzky somewhat perversely suggests here that the revolution requires sacrifices and transformation to bring a new, better world. Moreover, he implies that destruction of religion, including Judaism, is necessary to receive the Messiah, which seems somewhat paradoxical or heretical. However, despite this secular interpretation, Lissitzky consistently uses symbols that are profoundly religious, mystical, magical, and Kabbalistic. Revolutionary ideas were partly derived from the Jewish messianic belief in immanent redemption, class equality, the establishment of universal justice, the overcoming of time, and introducing of a utopian, unchanging ideal state. The Jewish masses in Russia enthusiastically supported the revolution, which not only overturned the anti-Semitic Tsarist restriction, but also announced the introduction of universal equality, freedom, and justice, which was utopia. Also, Lissitzky had hoped that the young generation would fully accept the revolutionary postulates. The scribes, he stated, expected a new era to come with the Messiah on a white horse, whereas he came in the form of a barefoot Soviet worker wearing torn and dirty clothes. Only the youngest generation could recognize him, end quote. So the postulate of my lecture is based on the conviction that the Red Wedge poster constitutes a kind of messianic tool which is meant to urge the Messiah to come as soon as possible. In my talk, I will try to show the iconic convergence between the messianic revolutionary interpretation and the old pictorial Jewish tradition referring to the same idea, which is messianism, urging the Messiah. Apart from being influenced by Malevich, Lissitzky's creative formula was inspired by Jewish pictorial sources, especially medieval manuscripts, Haggadahs, and the Kabbalistic program of decorating synagogues, which the artist knew well from his youth, and also from Marc Chagall, who was not only interested in Jewish mysticism and used Kabbalistic elements in his works, but promoted them among his students. When Chagall took up the post of the commissioner for art in Vitebsk in August 1918, he was perceived as a Jewish artist, gathering around him, as Vasily Radkin writes, a group of Talmudic expressionists, and encouraging the development of the so-called Jewish art. What, in my opinion, could have inspired Lissitzky to create the poster Red Wedge are two works by Chagall, Homage to Apollinaire and Dedicated to Christ, also known as Jewish Golgotha, both from 1912. The first work depicts the scene of a mystical separation of Adam and Eve placed against the background of a large clock with numbers 9011. This clock can be perceived as a huge eye, which is not mentioned in literature. The Cubist futuristic character of the eye appears in Chagall's works multiple times and can even be regarded the eye of the artist himself. What is especially intriguing here is that this Cubist futuristic work contains a red wedge, schematic but evident, resembling a splinter thrusting into the middle of a pupil. The other work by Chagall, Dedicated to Christ, depicts a passion scene also encapsulated in a Cubist futuristic painting formula. The motifs to pay special attention to here are two circles representing the sun and the moon, located in the upper part of the pictorial field, right and left. Both of the celestial bodies are broken, annihilated, and seem to be disappearing as kind of wedges drive into them. This aspect, of course, relates to the messianic prophecy of Isaiah 60:20. The sun shall set no more, and the moon shall not be eclipsed, and the days of the morning shall come to an end. Meaning that in the messianic age, after time has been conquered, there will be no more sunrises and sunsets, or moonsets. As Professor Ziva Avishai Meisels notes, the Kabbalistic and Messianic motif refers to the illustrations from the poem, refers to the illustrations from the Paimon Verimon book, published in Amsterdam in 1708, reproduced also in following centuries in Eastern Europe. It depicts the Lurianic Kabbalistic concept of tzimtzum, contraction, withdrawal, which alludes to the idea of the original cosmogonic catastrophe called breaking of the vessels, Shvirat HaKelim. Chagall, as Meisels writes, was inspired by this Kabbalistic book that referred to the creation of the world and the universe by the infinite God, Ein Sof, which literally means endless or infinite. The conventional process of creation or emanation is seen in the Kabbalistic tradition as a kind of two consecutive divine acts, or acts taking place within the deity itself, causing the primordial cosmogonic catastrophe. In the first act, Ein Sof, absolute fullness, endless, which is everywhere, had to separate some free area out of its infinite being from which it withdrew, which is tzimtzum, that creating a kind of mystical primeval space, an infinite abyss, an emptiness called Ain, or nothing, which God itself left to return to in the next act, that is the act of revelation and creation. The later act, which consisted in the process of emanating or simply creating the world, is depicted in this tradition as a beam of light or glow breaking into the shape of a circle, understood as Ain, the void. Here we can actually read Ein Sof. The most important thing in this concept, however, is that the mystical light, which serves as a medium for this process, caused a rupture in the structure of the world. The element of destruction is thus inherent in the process of creation, and the implied division between the infinite God and the finite world generates the need for repair, which in Kabbalah is called tikkun olam, world repair. This concept, in turn, has been taken up, or one could say heretically usurped, by the artistic avant-garde, earlier by the Kabbalists, who tried to build the world from scratch, with Lissitzky's flagship motto from 1920 manifesto, Suprematism in World Reconstruction, being an example of it. The journey to infinity, as he writes, ends with suprematism, which has broken the sky and gone into the limitless. Unquote. Generally, this Kabbalistic process, tzimtzum, is depicted in the Jewish tradition by means of a typical diagram, often taking the form of a broken and displaced circle with a sharp-edged triangle, or an axis penetrating the outline of that circle, which intensifies the dramatic character of the catastrophe taking place. The key idea is to present this circle as mutilated or deformed. The Paimon Verimon pattern is one of the oldest known examples of it in the Kabbalistic iconographic art. A painting by the Israeli artist Mordechai Ardon from 1953 entitled Gates of Light is a contemporary example featuring this motif. He goes a step further and breaks the circle in half to form two unaligned semicircles. The motif of the wedge, emphasized by the yellow or golden color, is a metaphor of a messianic opening, which is a visual echo of the cut made by the divine light penetrating Ain. Thus, Lissitzky's work is a metaphorical reflection of this cosmogonic catastrophe and feeds into the visual theoretical context of this analysis. The breaking of the vessels motif is also present in a drawing from the Zikaron Yerushalayim. Also at the first glance, it seems to depict Jerusalem in the form of a concentric spherical maze of walls. The manuscript shows Jericho and Joshua just before he enters the city. The architectural wedge appears to be opening the city from below, with the illustration referring to the traditional image of Jerusalem as a circle. The figure of Joshua alludes to the image of the Messiah at the gates of Jerusalem. The demolition of Jericho as another motive of destruction was an indispensable stage preceding the construction of Jerusalem and its temple by the successors of Joshua, David and Solomon. In analogy to Lissitzky's work, the idea of revolution refers to the notion of Messiah's arrival, whereas new architectural challenges are linked to the idea of building the perfect Jerusalem, wherever it may be. This utopian idea of building an ideal city, synonymous with the ideal world, was also familiar to Lissitzky and was at the core of the architectural concept of the Soviet avant-garde. But for Lissitzky, Jerusalem was Moscow, which he also wrote about in letters to his wife, Sophie. In the year of the final victory of the revolution, 1919, Lissitzky also made a series of watercolors for the old legend song Haggadah, One Baby Kid, based on biblical content traditionally attached to the last fragment of the Haggadah text and read out during the Passover feast, which is at the time of intensified awaiting of the Messiah. These illustrations do not correspond directly to the main content of the Haggadah, but they constitute an independent entity and convey a message which, in this case, is a manifestation of the victory of the Bolshevik Revolution, perceived as a triumph of God over evil, of sacrifice over persecutors, and as the victory of amended justice. The lyrics of the song describe a goat which is eaten by a cat and feature a list of adversaries until God eventually destroys the final enemy, the angel of death. Haggadah is an old folklore and metaphorical story brought probably from Babylonia, and it goes like that you can see on a screen, on a slide. These images and the text illustrating the inevitable cyclicity of evil are an allegory of the persecution of Jews in Tsarist Russia, but in the final scene, the hand and sword of the Creator comes and annihilates the angel of death. Overcoming the original evil in the form of death is crossing the threshold of eternity and the end of time, identified with Messianism. In 1920, another Jewish artist, Menachem Birnbaum, created similar illustrations to the same story published in Berlin by Welt Verlag. Comparing both versions of Haggadah, it is worth paying special attention to the last 10th page. While Lissitzky depicts a knife held by a hand, directed down and merely touching the angel of death with the blade, Birnbaum creates an extremely expressive and at the same time simply scene where the whole rectangular field of the image is sliced and divided into two halves. What we see here are horizontally placed wings and claws of the angel of death on a deep dark background, barely emerging from the darkness, which is divided by a sharp beam of light, giving the impression of a sheet being torn in half. Like a thin elongated wedge, it cuts through the black space at the very center of the rectangular pictorial field. In contrast to Lissitzky, Birnbaum does not show a sword or a knife, literally, but just a trace of it, which from the iconic perspective inevitably leads to a comparison with another work by Lissitzky, the Red Wedge, which is graphically, iconically, and semantically related with it, as well as shares its specific messages and the social historical background. The Jewish messianic idea, as Gershom Scholem writes, is in its origin and essence the theory of catastrophe and it always occurs in connection with the apocalyptic as a necessary with the apocalyptics as a necessary form of the messianism that is coming true. The message of the biblical prophets had already been expressed in certain socio-political terms and turned out to be effective in situations where the end was felt to be something that was about to come. Lissitzky's wedge, often read, has a similar semantic character. For example, the escape from Egypt and the crossing of the Red Sea was one of the most dramatic events in Jewish history. In the illustration from the Ashkenazi Bible, the wedge symbolizes Moses' magical act of setting the waters apart. Moreover, when in 1940 Great Britain closed the Palestinian border to Jewish immigration, a poster appeared on the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem depicting the Churchill white paper torn apart by a wedge in the shape of Eretz Israel. These works, like Lissitzky's wedge, are nothing else than an iconic intention to reverse the status quo by striving for utopian perfection through defeating evil. In this sense, these motifs are not only mystical but also magical in their attempts to use the theurgical character of symbols and signs to influence the imperfect work of creation. This utopian belief in the magical power of the tools of art is accompanied by a hope that the world can achieve its cosmogonic perfection. In 1919, Lissitzky also produced other works such as the series of illustrations for a children's book in Yiddish by Manilej Braiński entitled Singlefwat, Mischievous Boy. On the last page of the text, Lissitzky depicted a messianic rooster walking on the number 10, which in Hebrew is called the letter Yud. With this crowing, the rooster strips all power from evil spirits, the demons, and the forces of the dark power, and thus separates or cuts apart the day from the night, becoming a harbinger of a new dawn. Thus, it is Lissitzky's messenger who becomes a messianic troubadour of the revolution. Below, the artist has created a stylized form of a Kabbalistic phrase Ein Sof, endless, Aleph Sof, Aleph, Nun Tzadi Kuf Yud, and Yud, with a miniature image of an eye. The book ends here, but Ein Sof suggests its continuation or simply refers to broadly defined messianic aspects. The layout of the letters evokes a graphical dismemberment of the phrase, creating yet another wedge bridge that stretches from bottom to top. This graphic pattern seems to be taken from the 3rd century Sefer Yetzirah, Book of Creation, whose reproductions were available in rabbinical schools and yeshivas at the beginning of the 20th century. The Sefer Yetzirah is also translated as the Book of the Forming Letter Yud, which is presented in the Hebrew alphabet as a simple comma and has a numerical value of 10. What is important, this Yud is placed between each verse of the wedge-shaped text of the presented page. However, in each verse it is turned upside down, suggesting the act of driving or cutting the page from below. Thus the Yud cuts and at the same time creates the text, because the Book of Creation essentially tells the story of God's creation of the world by means of letters that constitute anonymous entities. Going further with the interpretation, and by analogy with the characteristic cut in Singlefwat's last illustration, we can assume that Lissitzky's Red Wedge from the 1919 poster is also a metaphor for the beginning of the act of writing, in which the letter Yud, identified with the wedge, is the original creative sign of gesture. According to Jewish tradition, the alphabet itself emerged from an infinitely small point, which then, in the evolution of writing, took on the form of a wedge and served as a basis for the creation of subsequent letters. Letter Yud is seen as this point, the smallest and most as the most basic original letter of the alphabet, a graphic sign generated by the simplest gesture of touching the surface with the stylus, which is starting the act of writing. For Kabbalists and also for the biblical peoples of the Middle East, writing has magical properties, and the basic sign from which the alphabet emerges is Yud, identified with a wedge, leading to the origin of the alphabet, that is cuneiform writing. It is one of the oldest varieties of writing in the world, created by Sumerians around 3000 BC. Its name, Latin cuneus, wedge, comes from the shape of characters inspired on imprinted on clay tablets by means of a piece of cane, bone, or a triangle-shaped stylus. Vertical, horizontal, and diagonal incisions represented whole words, turning into syllable-based writing over time. In the Middle East, the cuneiform formula was widely adopted and distributed by the Akkads, who adapted the Sumerian writing system to the Semitic language they used. The cuneiform system, further developed by the Assyrians, was modified after they adopted the Old Hebrew writing around the 7th century BC, which was influenced by the Greek in the following centuries, and finally, around the 2nd century BC in Judea, took on a form most similar to that of today. It is worth noting that today's Hebrew alphabet, since the Talmudic era, has been referred to as Ktaf Ashuri, which is the Assyrian writing, and the letter Yud, represented as a small comma, is an unchanged echo of the original sign, which is the wedge. Touching a soft clay tablet with a sharp stylus cuts its structure and thus enlivens the dead matter. Clay, in Hebrew Adam, is the material, usually red in color, from which, according to the Bible, man was created. The root of the word Adam refers not only to the word soil, earth, and man, but also to the words blood, and which is extremely meaningful in the face of the revolution, means red. According to Zohar and Sefer Yetzirah, man was created by a configuration of letters, which all these motifs being linked through the original letter Yud, identified with a wedge. Yud is the basic, primordial, and form-giving matrix of all subsequent letters. It is their integral part, and according to Zohar and Sefer Yetzirah, also Adam Kadmon was created not only from clay, but precisely by the configuration of letters. Moreover, in Old Hebrew, the word write is the same as the word open and develop, Hebrew patach, which many researchers associate with magical activities. Thus, the work of Lissitzky as a clear metaphor for breaking through and forming a new reality can be placed in the context of the letter Yud as the basic and original sign of creation by breaking, opening. In this sense, the Yud wedge symbol can be considered as a messianic tool of cosmic or cosmogonic upheaval, which from now on puts the world in order and subjects it to new rules. Yud, the primordial and infinitely small letter, writes or literally creates a new world, in line with the revolutionary ideas interchangeably with Kabbalistic ones. What emerges from this interpretational perspective of Lissitzky's work is a magical context, not only cosmogonic, but above all cosmolinguistic, associated with writings and letters. It seems directly from the ancient times, namely from Babylonian culture, and is often called the literature of Hayhalot, mystical palaces. It includes such books of Jewish mysticism as Sefer HaYashar, also known as Sefer HaMalbush, the book the Arba de Moshe, Sefer HaRazim, in its various versions, and above all Sefer Raziel, which both Chagall and Lissitzky were undoubtedly familiar with, since it was reproduced in Vilnius in the early 20th century for general use. This linguistic mystical context is the basis for the belief in the power of magical formulas, which include names of deities, names of angels and demons. As Maureen Bloom emphasizes in her book Jewish Mysticism and Magic, since ancient times, the way of expressing one's aspirations and misfortunes has been a written message, which is spells and magic words written, for example, on a scroll, on a bowl, or on an amulet made of parchment, clay, canvas, or metal, taking various geometric forms, most often a triangle. She goes on to write, I quote, "The creation of the world, already deliberately planned by God, can be seen as a kind of magic action described with the word lahat, whose root lamet haitet was later used to describe the activities of the pharaoh's mages, belachateichem, which means through its spells." It is also worth noting that rabbis often used a common formula to exorcise demons, crack, be crushed, broken, and driven away. This invocation should be viewed in the context of the powerful slogan contained in Lissitzky's poster "Beat the Whites" as a suggestion of a spell whose power is contained both in the imperative formula and in the geometric forms of a triangle and circle. The intention behind magical spells, as Bloom writes, is based on the conviction that the disorder caused by demons and evil powers can be reversed by the spell so that order can once again prevail. See revolution. Such a conviction, it seems, is also the base of Lissitzky's work, suggesting the possibility of restoring or utopian messianic harmony by interfering with the so-called evil pre-revolutionary powers. What is more, here, Lissitzky's Red Wedge destroys the evil forces of the enemy, and the aggressive intention of the wording "beat the whites" is intensified by the iconic destruction of the white circle. This general composition formula and the imperative-sounding slogan "beat the whites" brings to mind the magical tradition of warding off evil, demonic powers. The perfect white circle here is broken, defeated, desacralized, and thus deprived of any significance. Under the influence of the force of the wedge, it loses its balance and is pushed into the shadow, as if into darkness or underground. On the other hand, the word wedge, plenum, emerging on the left-hand side, is an extension of the triangle's blade itself, also carrying the dynamism of its direction along the diagonal line. The word white, in turn, is relegated to the right bottom corner of the image field, semantically strengthening the original concept of reduction of the enemy. Thus, Lissitzky's poster seems to convey the belief in the iconic power of art in the fight against the demons of evil, with the sharp-edged triangle being the main force. In this context, it is worth pointing out other magical aspects that Jewish tradition sees in the triangle. In Talmudic literature, we can find a large number of different kinds of names used in magical spells, and referring especially to the issue of fighting of evil powers and annihilation of demons. The spell is usually written in the form of a triangle pointing down and contains the name of that demon, reduced in subsequent verses to one letter as pterigomas. The symbolic magic of such a spell causes the power of the demon to be gradually subside, represented here as a deliberate and conscious visual reduction of the form, shape, and size of the word that is its name. For example, the name of the Blindik Shabriri demon was written in a way where you can see on a screen, where each subsequent abbreviated version of the name is placed under one another, creating a triangle with the letter Yud located at the very bottom. This act of reducing the demon's written name was believed to have the power of destroying the demon. The gradational reduction of the size of a single word in the inscription, as Theodor Schreyer in his Hebrew amulets writes, causes the weakening of this demon until its annihilation and disappearance. There are many similar amulets and formulas, such as the 1929 amulets against scorpions, The bottom of the parchment features a schematic drawing of 2 scorpions and 3 typical pterygomas above them, made by repeating the same phrase in the following consecutive verses, which one letter omitted each time, forming an acute triangular shape pointing down. Other typical formulas arranged in the form of a triangle or triangles are abracadabra, the name Argaman coming from the already mentioned Sefer Yezilah. The Argaman formula derives from the fragments of Song of Songs 767, is built from the first letters of the angelic names Uriel, Raphael, Gabriel, Michael, and Nuriel, and references to individual angels are based on the belief in the power of their intercession. The above-mentioned magical formulas, phrases, and incantations could have been known to Lissitzky himself, given the religiosity of his mother, the erudite nature of his father's education, and Lissitzky's knowledge of old traditional Yiddish culture legends, for which he created illustrations. Moreover, various types of talismans and amulets were popular in the environment in which the artists grow up, such as the protective amulet for newborn children, widely distributed in Vilnius, dating to 1870. This talisman amulet, printed on paper, could be like the book about 2 squirrels, folded, cut, framed, or put under a child's clothes or pillow. It is worthwhile to look at another work by Lissitzky, which is Self-Portrait, also known as The Constructor, from 1924, which on the interpretative level has, in my opinion, a lot in common with the work Red Wedge. The photomontage itself is extremely complex and intriguing. What is striking here is the specific placement of the head to the right and slightly down from the center of the image plane instead of the center, and the opening and placement of the compasses in the image field. Furthermore, it is interesting that the open hand is located horizontally and falls exactly in the place of the eye, which occupies the center of the palm, and the characteristic interweaving of planes, which is the head, eye, the hand, the compasses, and the circle. First of all, this circle, marked by the artist with the compasses, is partly obscured by the head and is often interpreted as a halo. The circle is located in the background, emerging from behind the head, and is shifted to the left. If, however, this incomplete circle was placed in the foreground, then its circumference would cross the middle of the artist's eye. Furthermore, the eye, being a point of the circumference of the circle, invites the viewer to draw a line diameter going from it through the center of the circle, which is the place where the compasses tips is driven. Then, if the next 2 points on the circle are connected, that is, the pupil of the eye and the drawing tip of the compasses located on the left side, just below the letter Y, a radius of a certain length is then created. Not only does it run through the artistic index fingertip, but reveals another geometrical figure, which is an acute angled triangle, the tip of which pierces the eye. The third line, which completes the triangle, is the axis running at an angle of 72 degrees from the point of the drawing tip to the point of contact with the line of the already marked diameter, cutting along the letter Z. So a sharp golden triangle is made by connecting the key points in the work, which is the pupil, the drawing tip of the compasses, and the point where 2 lines, the diameter, and the segments that completes the triangle intersects. This perspective on the geometric arrangement of elements in the painting, especially where the triangle pierces the artist's eye, opens a whole realm of possible interpretations. First of all, the triangle or wedge stuck into the eye is an iconographic motif connected with the concept of the eye of evil, appearing in many cultures, including the Jewish one, Ayin Hara. Moreover, the eye situated on the hand refers to the traditional representations of the Hamsa, an amulet in the form of a hand, often with the eye located inside of it. Next, the motif of an incomplete circle and the wedge in its outline is an illustrative metaphor for the Kabbalistic process of creating the world through the act of breaking up, splitting, or dividing. Also, in the Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge, Lissitzky operates with a specific narrative and forces or geometric structures with the motive of piercing the circle with a wedge or golden triangle along the diagonal line in exactly the same position as in the word self-portrait, playing a crucial role. Thus, both the Red Wedge and self-portrait appear to feature intriguing parallels to the Jewish Kabbalah, especially to the tradition of depicting the concept of the cosmogonical catastrophe in the process of world creation. The concept of emptiness, ayin, or nothingness, is an indispensable condition of this creation, and in art and Kabbalah it appears as a multifaceted and capacious image metaphor. In the Red Wedge, this motif can be viewed in a broad and universal way, but in the self-portrait, the question arises, why does the artist aim here at his own eye, and what can it mean? This aspect can be explained on a linguistic level. The term ayin in the Hasidic tradition also appears as a basis for a specific verbal discourse which employs etymological similarities of certain component words. In addition to the meaning of emptiness or nothing, ayin is also translated as source or eye. The word iyun, derived from the core of ayin, means contemplation. The term is identical in Jewish tradition to annihilation. Moreover, ayin has the same consonants as the word I, written down as ani, first person singular, and which also translates as poor and poverty. It is worth mentioning that that Philo of Alexandria had already written, creation as an independent whole, including man, is reduced to nothingness, but contemplation of this fact inevitably leads us to the presence of God. The creation meets its creator when it recognizes its emptiness, its nothingness. It is therefore important to learn to plumb the measure of its nothingness. End quote. Moreover, in the Babylonian Talmud, in Hilum 1980a, Rabbi Abba's statement is quoted. The world exists only because of who considers himself non-existent. Also in Sotach 21b treatise, there is a quote after Rabbi Johan, where the words of Torah exist only because of who considers himself non-existent, also supported by the verse in Hiob 28:12. The Hasidic leader Dov Ber of Mezibush even suggested to his disciples that in meditation of phrase ani, I should be changed into ayin or nothingness. In his opinion, the analogy of these phrases solves the problem of separation of man from God, and it is a dialectic process. It's dialectic process in which we accomplish the so-called adherence to the deity, which is devekut. It is therefore right, as Magid Meshulam Feibush Heller from Zbrash wrote in turn, for man to think of himself as nothingness. Above all, however, the classic term used to refer to the practice of meditation on nothingness, lehistakel be'ayin, is understood in spoken form as to look with the eye. Also, the literal translation means to look at nothing or nothingness. While analyzing the self-portrait, it is worth noting that Lissitzky not only puts emphasis on only one of his eyes by darkening the other, but with this one eye, he looks not at the viewer, but as if far away ahead. Lissitzky presents himself here as if in deep thoughts, and thus, as Ruth after Gabriel also writes, staring into the void. What is more, this one cyclopic eye is also exposed to the point of the wedge, drawn by the configuration of the elements in the picture described above. The piercing or breaking of the void, ain or eye, contains many interpretative possibilities, and this gesture can be understood as a metaphorical call for revolutionary reconstruction of the world. On the other hand, this term appears as an act of self-blinding, annihilation, which again metaphorically can be understood as a gesture of giving up the ambition to be a truly creative artist in the name, or rather out of necessity, of becoming a constructor, a manufacturer, at the service of the communist system. At that time, 1924, Lissitzky understood perfectly well that the idea of the artist demiurge in the new Lenin system was lost, and the whole creative community was subjected to political surveillance. The work seems to be a desperate expression of loss of faith in the role of the artist on the one hand, and a reference to the Kabbalistic perspective on the other, on the Red Wedge on the other. The work that might have inspired Lissitzky, as already mentioned, is Homage to Apollinaire by Marc Chagall from 1912. Leaving aside the main theme of the hermaphroditic separation of Adam and Eve, in the background, we see a big eye with a red wedge or a few wedges pointing straight into the middle of the eye. Generally, blindness in art is a metaphor of annihilating evil or an evil charm, and in the case of Lissitzky's work, destruction of the white gods, the Tsiyer, and the Orthodox Church as incarnation of this evil. This motif, blindness, in a way also refers to the so-called concept of the eye of evil, present since ancient times in almost all Mediterranean, Sumerian, and Babylonian cultures. Believing in the evil eye, in Hebrew ayin hara, Latin malochium, is based on the conviction that a gaze or a bad will can cause harm to a person or an object. A way to counteract this is to use amulets containing God's name and other apotropaic symbols, as such hamsas, and the motif of the eye, which according to the principle of reflection will deflect the evil eye. According to the Talmud, the eye of evil has no power over Joseph and his descendants, a belief that was derived from Jacob's blessing over Joseph, Genesis 49:22. The source word used here, ayin, also means eye, so according to this interpretation, Joseph is beyond the eye of evil. In this way, he became an important figure in the Jewish magical tradition, and this verse is used in many amulets. Ben Yosef Porat. The expression Bli Ain Hara is another remedy. Since antiquity, the motif of the eye of evil has also been commonly used on various kinds of amulets featuring the same image drawn in a conventional and quite schematic way, namely an eye attacked by different animals. One of the oldest examples in the Jewish tradition is a painting from the synagogue in Dura Europos from 2nd century AD, which depicts a big eye attacked by birds, a snake, a scorpion, and 3 daggers or spears or wedges failing from above. A similar pattern can be found on the Byzantine floor mosaic from Antioch, where this iconographic motif was composed on the basis of the Hebrew magic formula called Testament of Solomon, and is also called in literature as a much-suffering eye. The most popular medium for this motif in ancient and Byzantine times were small amulets in which illustrations were reduced to basic, even abstract graphic motifs. One of the most interesting Examples is the brown pendant from the 5th century, depicting from left lion, ibis, snake, scorpion, and leopard attacking the evil eye. The Greek inscription goes, Lord of hosts, Michael help. Another almost identical example is a pendant deposited in the Kinsley Museum of Archaeology in Ann Arbor from the same time. Here this motif is placed on the reverse side, while on the obverse there is a scene of a horse rider piercing a demon with a spear. And this motif is also very much related to the iconography of Lissitzky's work, Red Wedge. Generally, the iconographic motif of a horse rider, the figure of the Holy Rider, driving a spear through a demon in the form of a dragon, snake, crocodile, or other monster, lying on the ground at the feet of the horse, is one of the most popular signs of annihilating evil, defeating an enemy, or manifesting power. By the way, in 1940s, this motif was used as a military decoration in the area of the British Mandate. Since the early antiquity, this symbol has appeared not only in Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Roman art, but also in Jewish art. It is called the Seal of Solomon and is very often found among objects retrieved from Jewish Hellenized houses in the Mediterranean area. Next to the figure of the horseman killing the demon Lilith, there was usually a lion and the name Solomon, most often in Greek, as well as the phrase the seal of God on the reverse side. This is not only a symbol of victory, but also an amulet containing magical properties to help defeat all evil. Solomon is valued for his wisdom and his ability to control and banish demons, and therefore has a special place in Jewish magic. In European medieval art, this motif is first identified with the Archangel Gabriel and then with Saint George piercing a dragon with a lance, which has become popular in Northern Europe, the patron saint of England, including the Scandinavian countries, but above all in Russia. Since the 15th century, this image has been present on the coat of arms of the great dukes of Moscow, Dmitry Donsky and Vasily I, and since the 16th century, it has been the patron saint of Moscow and Russia. In the second half of the 18th century, Catherine II established the Order of St. George as the highest Russian military decoration, and nowadays this motif is in the center of the coat of arms of the Russian Federation. The question arises as to how this relates to Lissitzky's wedge. His poster is an adaptation, it may be an adaptation, of the old symbol of annihilation of evil, reduced by the artist to a suprematist abstraction. The old image of St. George has been limited to the simplest geometric figures while preserving its meaningful essence. Generally, the iconic image of St. George is the same across its reproductions and can be actually reduced to a basic blade killing the primordial evil, which semantically corresponds to Lissitzky's wedge. The transition from realism to abstraction, while preserving the basic meaning of the work, is quite common for Lissitzky. An example. Let's compare two different versions of the cover for Singlechwat, Mischievous Boy, designed by Lissitzky in 1918 and second in 1919. In the first version, we see a generally recognizable image of a young horseman, while the second version features a mere trace of the original motif. It seems as if the artist quoted himself, but using a different artistic language. The picture, like a wedge, is reduced to a basic visual form or skeleton. The horse and rider are drawn by means of simple lines, but the full message of the symbol is preserved. Moreover, in 1923, the Berlin branch of Moscow State Publishing House published a book with Vladimir Mayakovsky's works entitled De la Glossa, for the Voice, for which Lissitzky made a series of illustrations. The book was later banned in Russia. On the page including How the Good Mother Foolish Hagrid about Wrangler, the artist put the former Romanov emblem, which was invalidated in 1917, but importantly, with the eagle's heads cut off. The act of desacralization of the emblem is also very significant here, with the wall motif having been reversed by swapping the scepter and globe in the bird's claws and reversing the motif of St. George from right to left. Here we are dealing not only with a symbolic reversal of the world narrative, but also with the reversal of time, which is a messianic evocation. In the Russian tradition, such a reversal is called a lubok, and it is a satirical representation of the world in reverse. Similarly, Hadgadia can also be read backwards, thus it is a palindrome. Referring to Mark Epstein and his book Dreams of Subversion in Medieval Jewish Art and Literature, such a motif can be considered as the image of the topsy-turvy world, where the whole pretext of hand harnessing is reversed, and now the pursues their pursuers. This, as Epstein continues, seems to refer to the messianic hopes of Jews for the ultimate restoration. It is worth noting that at the same time, in 1918, a poster depicting Leon Trotsky, a Red Army general, as St. George killing a dragon, a Leviathan, a strictly messianic symbol, appeared in popular circulation. As Yuri Shleskin writes in his book, The Age of the Jews, I quote, the Red Army was the only force that sincerely and consistently stood against Jewish pogroms, and the only one that was commanded by a Jew. Trotsky was not only a general or a prophet, he was the living incarnation of redemptive violence, the sword of revolutionary justice, and at the same time, the Leon Davidovich Bronstein, whose field school was a header. As Shleskin continues, for the Russian Jews, the revolution was the last war to end all wars, Armageddon at the threshold of eternity. And at the same time, in the same place, Shleskin writes, I quote, no icon expresses the revolutionary era better than Red Wedge poster by Lissitzky. So Trotsky can be that very triangle, end quote. The use of the triangle in revolutionary propaganda was also a widely recognized reference to Jewishness. Jewishness, as Shleskin writes, was not only the way to represent the triangle here, but it was one of the best known and aesthetically convincing ways. According to Wassily Kandinsky, the triangle was smarter than a square and less Philistine than a circle. Thus, stylistically, it was also more Jewish than Russian. End quote. In turn, according to one of the protagonists of Ilya Ehrenburg's prose, Lenin could have been a ball, Bukharin was a straight line, but Trotsky, a chess player and the leader of the steppe hordes, he is a triangle. Also a character of Anatoly Arosev's prose, Terenti the Forgotten declares, if I were a futuristic artist, I would present Trotsky as two triangles facing down, a small triangle face on top, a large triangle, the rest of the body, end quote. It seems that it is no coincidence that in 1918 in Moscow, on the site of an old monument in honor of Tsar Nikolai, a new monument to commemorate the great days of the Russian Socialist Revolution was erected on the initiative of Lenin himself. The author of the monument was Nikolai Kola, and the work itself was called Monument to the Red Wedge. The monument consists of a red triangle or wedge driven vertically into a white rectangular block. The crack travels down from the tip of the triangle, breaking the white monolith. The abstract metaphor was intended to signify the victory of the Red Army, led by Leon Trotsky, over the white counter-revolutionary forces. This wedge can therefore be considered as a metaphor for the figure of Trotsky himself, who interestingly enough used the wedge metaphor in one of his political texts. According to Christina Lodder, I quote, by harnessing military and political terminology, which imbued the forms and colors with ideological associations, the monument managed to convey an ideological narrative which would have been comprehensible to all levels of society, the literate as well as the illiterate, end quote. Here we have reached the starting point. That is the work of L. Lissitzky's Red Wedge, which was created at the same time. The kind of violence contained in the abstract geometric form, but also in the phrase "beat the whites," is seen as an important factor in helping the Messiah, and has a clear metaphorical references in which a sharp point violates the circle. The new revolutionary iconography was supposed not only to adapt and substitute the old iconic motifs, but to give them a new political and historical interpretation. This was accompanied by the idea of developing a new avant-garde artistic language, the key example being the poster by Lissitzky. To sum up, Lissitzky's avant-garde art features multi-faced ambiguity. On the one hand, it seems to present a new total vision of the world, a definitive and rational proposal for its reconstruction. On the other hand, it plays with sophisticated symbolism, full of direct and intentionally hidden references and quotations from the old iconic Jewish tradition. Thus, the Red Wedge, a seemingly abstract geometric work of art, becomes an extremely meaningful declaration of the symbolic breakdown of the old order, where the act itself, the breakdown, is perceived in absolute, total, and even cosmogonic categories. The messianic background here legitimizes the new order that will follow the annihilation of the forces of evil and encourage the adoption of the new suprematist testament. The wedge and the broken circle taken from Chagall are thus an important messianic revolutionary tool, breaking down the old vessels and prying open the door to new times. Thank you very much.